The Apache woman stopped so suddenly that the mountain man nearly collided with her, her hand lifting in a sharp, instinctive motion as she whispered for him not to look there, her voice tight with urgency and something deeper, fear braided with reverence. They stood at the edge of a narrow ravine where the land seemed to fold inward on itself, the air cooler and heavy with the scent of damp stone and old pine. He obeyed for a heartbeat, eyes fixed on the ground, but the warning itself carried a weight that pulled at him, and when he finally lifted his gaze, what he saw rooted him in place. It was not what he expected, not danger in the form of an ambush or a wild animal, but something far more unsettling, a scar on the land itself, a place where the earth had been cut open long ago, revealing layers of stone arranged like ribs, blackened and fractured as if burned from within. The silence there was unnatural, swallowing sound, and even the wind seemed to hesitate before crossing the threshold. The Apache woman's face had gone pale, her eyes reflecting a history he could not see, and she lowered her hand slowly, knowing the damage was already done. She told him this place was avoided, spoken of only in warnings, a site where suffering had once gathered so thick it seeped into the ground. Long before either of them were born, people had come here seeking refuge and found instead a slow, cruel end, trapped by winter and enemies both seen and unseen. The mountain man felt the chill crawl up his spine as he listened, not because of superstition, but because the land itself seemed to confirm her words. Trees leaned away from the ravine as if recoiling, their roots gripping the soil in defensive knots, and the stones bore marks that looked too deliberate to be natural. He tried to step back, but his legs refused him for a moment, his mind racing through years of solitude and hard-earned calm, all of it disrupted by the raw intensity of that place. He had seen death before, harsh, sudden, and quiet, but this was different, layered and lingering, as if grief had weight and mass. The Apache woman spoke softly now, explaining that her people believed certain places remembered what happened upon them, that the land could carry sorrow the way a body carries scars. She said this was why she had warned him, not to protect him from fear, but from carrying something away with him that could not be easily set down. The mountain man forced himself to breathe slowly, grounding his senses in the present, the feel of solid earth beneath his boots, the steady rhythm of his heart, the sound of her voice anchoring him. He realized then that his shock came not from what he saw, but from the understanding that even the wilderness he trusted so deeply held stories beyond his knowing. For years, he had believed solitude stripped life down to its truths, but here was proof that some truths remained buried, demanding respect rather than conquest or understanding. He lowered his gaze again, this time by choice, and nodded once, acknowledging her warning at last. They retreated together, step by careful step, until the air felt lighter and the forest sounds returned, tentative at first, then fully alive. Only when the ravine was hidden behind trees did the mountain man realize his hands were trembling. The Apache woman watched him closely, not with judgment, but with quiet empathy, knowing that the shock he felt marked a crossing of its own. She told him that seeing such places changed a person, not by breaking them, but by reminding them how small and interconnected everything truly was. He understood then why she had feared his gaze lingering too long. Some sights demanded humility, not curiosity. As they continued on, the mountain man found his awareness sharpened, every step deliberate, every sound meaningful. The forest no longer felt like something to be mastered or navigated alone, but a living presence deserving careful attention. He realized that survival was not only about strength and skill, but about knowing when to look away, when to listen, and when to accept that some knowledge came with a cost. The Apache woman walked beside him in silence, her warning fulfilled, her duty to the land honored. That night, as they camped beneath a sky crowded with stars, the mountain man found sleep slow to come. The image of the ravine lingered at the edge of his thoughts, not as terror, but as a solemn reminder of endurance and loss. He understood now that shock was not weakness, it was the body and mind recognizing something profound. And in that recognition, he felt a deeper respect for the woman who had tried to shield him, and for the land that held its memories without ever speaking a word. The next morning broke with a thin veil of mist clinging to the forest floor, as if the land itself were reluctant to fully wake after what had been remembered. The mountain men rose early, moving quietly so as not to disturb the stillness, and tended the fire with deliberate care. The Apache woman watched him from across the embers, her expression thoughtful, measuring the change she sensed in him. Neither spoke at first, words felt too blunt for what lingered between them. The forest sounded different now, every bird call clearer, every rustle more deliberate, like a language demanding closer listening. He noticed how she traced symbols in the dirt with a stick, small patterns that mirrored the paths of water and wind, and he understood she was grounding herself, reaffirming balance after walking near a place that carried so much weight. They set out after the sun lifted higher, choosing a route that curved wide around the ravine, respecting the boundary without needing to mark it. As they walked, she shared fragments of stories, not legends meant to frighten, but lessons shaped by survival. She spoke of how her people learned to recognize places of grief and power, not to fear them, but to acknowledge them and move on without disturbance. The mountain man listened with the same attention he gave to weather signs and tracks, recognizing that this knowledge was as practical as any map. He realized that his shock had not been a failing, it had been an opening, a reminder that experience did not equal ownership. The terrain grew gentler as they descended toward a stream, sunlight breaking through branches in shifting bands. The mountain man felt steadier with each step, his breathing syncing with the cadence of the trail. He noticed how she paused at crossings, touching the water lightly before moving on, a gesture of thanks that cost nothing and returned calm. He adopted the habit without thinking, finding that it sharpened his focus. When they stopped to rest, he studied the marks on the stones and the direction of the current, integrating her teachings with his own hard-earned instincts. The forest felt less like a test and more like a conversation. Later, they encountered signs of old passage, weathered posts half swallowed by earth, a collapsed shelter overtaken by moss. The Apache woman knelt, examining the remnants, and explained how people once moved through these mountains in cycles, never lingering where the land asked for rest. The mountain man felt a quiet humility settle in his chest. He had believed his solitude made him invisible to history, but here were traces proving otherwise, lives lived carefully, choices made with restraint. He understood that survival was not merely enduring the present, but honoring what came before to make room for what followed. As dusk approached, they made camp near a stand of firs that broke the wind. The mountain men prepared a simple meal, and they ate without hurry, sharing the silence as something earned. When the stars emerged, he found the sky comforting rather than distant, its vastness no longer overwhelming. He thanked her, simply and sincerely, for the warning she had given, and for the trust she had shown in walking with him afterward. She nodded, accepting the words without ceremony, and reminded him that looking away can be an act of strength. Sleep came easier that night. The ravine no longer intruded as an image of shock, but rested in his thoughts as a boundary acknowledged and respected. He dreamed of paths that curved rather than cut straight through, of hands guiding without pushing, of a land that remembered yet allowed healing. When he woke before dawn, the forest felt whole again, not emptied of sorrow, but balanced by understanding. He knew then that the journey ahead would be shaped not by what he dared to face, but by what he chose to honor, and by the quiet wisdom of listening when warned, even after the moment had passed. Morning unfolded slowly, the light filtering through the fir branches in pale layers, and the mountain man felt a steadiness he had not known before, as if the land had accepted their choice to pass with respect. He packed camp with care, erasing signs of their stay until only flattened grass remained, and noticed the Apache woman doing the same in her own way, smoothing earth with the side of her foot, returning stones to their places. They moved on without discussion, following a path shaped more by intuition than direction, and he realized how much he trusted her sense of the land now. The forest opened into a meadow rimmed with wildflowers gone to seed, and the air carried the clean promise of change. He felt the shock from the ravine settling into something quieter, a lesson absorbed rather than resisted. As the day warmed, she spoke again, this time about balance, how every warning carried responsibility, and how every witness carried choice. She said that some places taught by presence alone, and others by absence, and knowing which was which kept a person alive in more ways than one. The mountain man listened, weighing her words against years of self-reliance, and felt them fit without strain. He had survived by skill and caution, but this was something adjacent to survival, an ethic of movement, a way of passing through without taking what could not be replaced. He adjusted his pace to hers, not slowing, not hurrying, and found that the trail seemed to meet them halfway. They crossed a river by a narrow ford where stones rose like steps, and he offered his hand only when the current tugged hard. She accepted briefly, then moved on, sure-footed again, and the exchange carried no debt, only acknowledgement. On the far bank, they rested, and he noticed how the forest sounded richer here, layered with insects and birds, as if life itself thickened where water flowed freely. He understood then that the land offered renewal as readily as it held memory, and that both required attention. The shock he had felt was not meant to linger, it was meant to sharpen. By afternoon, clouds gathered, not threatening, just thoughtful, and the light dimmed to a reflective gray. They found an overlook where the valley stretched wide, ridges folding into one another like a slow breath. The mountain man felt a quiet gratitude, toward the woman beside him, toward the land that had corrected him without cruelty, toward the patience he was learning to practice. He realized that solitude had once been his shield, but now companionship, careful, respectful, was becoming a teacher. He did not name the change, he simply allowed it. When rain finally came, it was gentle, a soft percussion on leaves. They took shelter beneath a rock outcrop and waited, sharing dried food and warmth. The Apache woman closed her eyes and listened, counting the spaces between drops, and he followed her lead, finding calm in the cadence. The forest seemed to approve, settling into its own rhythm. When the rain passed, the air felt newly washed, and the trail ahead gleamed with possibility rather than challenge. They resumed walking as dusk approached, and the mountain men sensed that the path forward would continue to offer moments of warning and wonder in equal measure. He knew now that staring was not the same as seeing, and that freezing in shock could become standing in respect if one learned from it. The Apache woman walked on, steady and composed, and he followed, not behind, not ahead, but alongside, ready to listen when the land, or she, asked him not to look, and wiser for having learned why. Night gathered around them as they found a place to rest where the ground rose slightly, safe from water and open enough to watch the sky. The mountain men set the fire low, more glow than flame, and the Apache woman arranged stones in a small circle, a habit that spoke of intention rather than necessity. The quiet felt earned. He noticed how the forest at night no longer pressed in on him. Instead, it seemed to hold space, as if acknowledging the care with which they moved. The memory of the ravine no longer startled him, it steadied him, a reminder that restraint could be as powerful as action. In the hours before sleep, she spoke of paths that return you to yourself. Not all journeys, she said, were meant to arrive somewhere new, some were meant to correct your angle, to tilt you back toward balance. The mountain man considered his years alone, the way he had measured success by endurance and silence. He realized that listening, truly listening, had been the missing skill. The land had been speaking all along, he had simply been surviving loudly enough not to hear it. At dawn, frost traced the edges of leaves, and their breath made brief clouds in the cold air. They moved carefully, conserving warmth and energy, choosing a route that followed the sun. He watched how she judged distance by shadow and time by temperature, and he adjusted his own habits to match. The forest rewarded them with ease, clear footing, visible water, signs of game that kept a respectful distance. He felt a quiet confidence settle in, not the sharp confidence of conquest, but the calm assurance of alignment. They encountered another boundary by midday, a fallen stand of trees from an old storm, trunks piled like a wall. The mountain men studied it for a way through, but the Apache woman touched his sleeve and angled them around the edge. The detour cost time but saved effort. He smiled at the simplicity of it. Not every obstacle was a challenge to be solved, some were invitations to choose differently. As they walked on, he sensed how these small choices added up, shaping not just their route but their understanding. Later, they paused near a stand of aspens whose leaves whispered even without wind. She explained how certain places offered counsel if you stayed long enough, how the sound itself could settle a troubled mind. They rested there, letting the whispering do its work. The mountain man felt the last of his tension ease, replaced by a steady clarity. He knew then that the shock he'd felt days earlier had opened a door, not to fear, but to discernment. As evening approached, they reached a high shoulder of land overlooking a broad sweep of forest and river beyond. The mountain man took in the view without gripping it, allowing it to be vast without needing to own it. The Apache woman stood beside him, hands relaxed, gaze steady. They shared a moment that required no words, a recognition that moving forward would mean continuing to choose respect over impulse, listening over staring. When they turned back toward camp, the trail felt familiar, even welcoming. The mountain man understood that the wilderness had not changed, he had. He carried forward a new measure for strength, one that included humility, patience, and the courage to look away when warned. And as they walked together into the lengthening shadows, he felt certain that whatever lay ahead, he would meet it with steadier eyes and a quieter heart. The following morning, a crisp clarity hung in the air as the mountain man and the Apache woman prepared to continue their journey through the forest. The sun filtered through the canopy in pale beams, illuminating dew on leaves and the shimmer of spider webs stretched between branches. She moved with purpose, stepping lightly over roots and rocks, her gaze sweeping constantly for subtle changes in the terrain. He followed her lead, noting how she paused to examine small tracks in the mud, identifying the creatures that had passed through the night. Each observation she made deepened his respect, not just for her skill, but for the careful attentiveness that allowed her to move safely through a world that could so easily betray the unprepared. They reached a ridge overlooking a bend in the river, and the Apache woman gestured silently toward the opposite bank. He studied it with measured attention, noting shallow spots where the water rippled differently, suggesting safer crossings. She had begun to anticipate hazards instinctively, and he realized that his role had shifted entirely, he was no longer her guide in the traditional sense but a companion, present to support, ready to intervene only if she chose it. This subtle shift in dynamics was more profound than any survival tactic. They had established trust without words, a partnership forged through patience and observation. As they descended toward the river, a light mist rose from the water's surface, clinging to the legs of trees and the rocks along the bank. She paused, listening, her hand raised slightly, sensing the flow of current and the hidden depths beneath it. The mountain man mirrored her stance, taking a moment to recalibrate his own senses in response to hers. It was a shared vigilance, a silent conversation with the landscape. They moved slowly, deliberately, each step considered, each sound measured, until they reached a stretch where stones formed a natural stepping path. Crossing it was a test of balance and attention, and she did so with the confidence of someone who had been mastering her body and mind over weeks of practice. He crossed alongside her, ensuring support but allowing her independence to guide the movement. On the far bank, the forest thickened, shadows deepening under the canopy. They pressed on carefully, recognizing the change in terrain as both a challenge and an opportunity. The Apache woman demonstrated a keen awareness of subtle environmental cues, the tilt of a branch, a displaced rock, a faint scent on the wind. The mountain man followed silently, marveling at how she translated instinct and observation into action, moving through the wilderness with a fluidity and confidence he had rarely seen. It became clear that the lessons he had taught, patience, attentiveness, respect, had taken root in ways deeper than he could have imagined. By late afternoon, they reached a small clearing where sunlight broke through the trees, revealing a patch of wildflowers swaying in a gentle breeze. The Apache woman knelt to examine them, noting which were edible or useful for medicine, her movements deliberate and precise. The mountain man observed quietly, realizing that survival had become more than navigating terrain. It was learning to read every element of the environment, to extract knowledge, and to integrate it into decision-making. The forest, once merely a backdrop to survival, had become a partner, offering lessons and requiring mindfulness in return. As they set up a temporary camp, the mountain men prepared the fire while she gathered water and arranged a small shelter. Their movements were harmonious, each respecting the other's space and timing. That evening, the forest around them seemed alive with quiet energy, the rustle of nocturnal animals, the distant call of birds settling in for the night, and the subtle movement of leaves in the breeze. The Apache woman studied the patterns, noting which animals were active, which areas were safe, and which routes might serve as observation points the following day. He watched her take notes in her journal, each entry a testament to her growing mastery over both herself and the environment. Night deepened, and stars began to emerge through gaps in the canopy. They sat near the fire, the glow illuminating their faces, and shared no words. None were needed. The mountain men felt a sense of completeness, a recognition that the initial shock of the ravine and the lessons it had imposed had been necessary. They had moved past fear into understanding, from survival into a rhythm of awareness, patience, and quiet strength. The Apache woman looked to the sky, and he followed her gaze, both silently acknowledging the journey they had undertaken and the respect it demanded. Dawn arrived with a crisp, golden light spilling over the ridges, painting the forest in shades of amber and green. The mountain men moved deliberately, gathering firewood and checking the small traps he had set along the clearing's edge. The Apache woman watched him, her own body now strong and confident, movements precise and fluid, a testament to the lessons of patience, observation, and regained autonomy she had absorbed over weeks in the wilderness. She carried her journal carefully, noting not only observations of the land but reflections on her own resilience, the ways in which fear had been transformed into understanding, and the quiet pride that came from mastering both the body and mind in this untamed environment. Each step she took reflected a growing harmony with the forest, a rhythm that mirrored the mountain man's own, yet distinct in its awareness and intent. They moved toward a narrow valley where the terrain sloped steeply, requiring careful attention to footing. The Apache woman led, her eyes scanning for subtle changes in the soil, the direction of the wind, and signs of recent animal passage. The mountain man followed, offering support when necessary but allowing her autonomy to dictate pace and path. He noted how she paused at minor obstacles, testing balance and stability, choosing the path that conserved energy while maintaining safety. This deliberate pace, so different from the hurried survival instinct he had once relied on alone, allowed them to move efficiently while respecting the land and themselves. Every decision, no matter how small, became a practice in mindfulness, reinforcing skills that had become second nature to her. Midday brought them to a stream cascading over smooth stones, sunlight dancing on the rippling surface. They paused to drink and wash, the cool water grounding them after the exertion of climbing. She tested the depth with a stick first, then stepped in carefully, balancing against the current, while he mirrored her actions with cautious respect. The forest around them seemed to breathe in tandem with their own movements, alive with the quiet hum of life, insects flitting between plants, distant birds calling to one another, and the soft murmur of water against rocks. The mountain man felt a profound stillness settle over him, a calm derived not from solitude, but from shared awareness and respect for the natural world. Continuing along the bank, they encountered a fallen tree bridging the stream. The Apache woman assessed it quickly, testing its stability with a foot before stepping onto it, arms extended for balance. The mountain man followed her example, recognizing that her approach demonstrated both confidence and prudence. Crossing required focus and coordination, and each careful step reinforced the synergy between instinct and reason. She moved with a fluidity born of repeated practice, a dance with the elements rather than a battle against them. Her confidence was infectious. He found himself moving more deliberately, attuned to subtle shifts in terrain, aware of the environment in ways he hadn't considered during years of solitary living. After the crossing, they ascended a gentle slope leading to a ridge that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. From this vantage point, the mountainman noticed patterns in the landscape he had previously overlooked, wind-blown clearings indicating animal trails, rock formations marking safe pathways, and patches of vegetation signaling sources of food or medicinal plants. The Apache woman pointed out these subtle cues, explaining their significance with quiet precision. He realized that her knowledge was both intuitive and experiential, drawn from observation, patience, and an intimate relationship with the land that transcended mere survival. As afternoon shadows lengthened, they descended toward a hidden grove where a natural spring emerged, cool and clear. The Apache woman knelt beside it, tasting the water, examining the surrounding soil, and noting the location in her journal. The mountain men respected the thoroughness of her assessment, recognizing that each detail mattered for long-term safety and planning. They rested, hydrating and replenishing energy, the forest around them quiet except for the soft trickle of water. Here, he felt the culmination of his teachings, patience, observation, and respect for the land had been internalized by her, and he marveled at how seamlessly she moved through the wilderness with autonomy and skill. Evening approached as they set up camp near the spring, the light filtering through the canopy in warm, fading tones. The Apache woman arranged stones for a fire, gathered wood, and set a small cooking area, each movement deliberate and efficient. The mountain men prepared a modest meal while observing her, noting how she integrated careful planning, environmental awareness, and practicality into every task. Their partnership had evolved into a silent choreography, trust expressed through actions rather than words, each respecting the space and autonomy of the other. As night fell, stars emerged through the gaps in the canopy, and they sat beside the fire, reflecting silently on the day's lessons. The Apache woman shared observations about animal activity, water sources, and subtle signs of weather change, her insights precise and measured. The mountain men listened, internalizing both the information and the method by which she acquired it, careful attention, respect for the land, and patience in observation. Together, they had transformed the forest into a living classroom, where survival was inseparable from understanding, and every choice carried meaning. By the time sleep claimed them, both felt a deep sense of alignment with the wilderness and with each other. The shock and awe that had once dominated encounters with the unknown had been replaced by a measured awareness, confidence, and respect. They were no longer merely surviving, they were moving intentionally, learning, and mastering the subtle language of the forest. And as the fire's glow faded into embers, the mountain men realized that this shared journey had taught him something equally profound. Strength and trust were not found alone, but cultivated through attention, patience, and the willingness to see, and sometimes to look away, when the land demanded it. The following morning, the forest was alive with the soft stirrings of wildlife, and the mountain men and the Apache woman prepared to move once again, their bodies acclimated to the rhythms of the wilderness. Sunlight pierced the canopy in narrow streams, illuminating patches of moss and casting intricate shadows across the forest floor. The Apache woman led with confidence, pausing occasionally to touch a leaf, note a track, or listen to a faint rustle in the undergrowth. The mountain men followed at a respectful distance, observing how she read the environment with intuitive precision, integrating all five senses into every decision. Each pause, each careful movement, was a practice in mindfulness, teaching him that survival was as much about attention as it was about strength or skill. As they moved toward a narrow gorge, the terrain became steeper, roots and rocks creating natural obstacles that required careful navigation. She tested every foothold before committing her weight, arms extended subtly for balance, while he mirrored her caution without interfering. It was a dance of trust. She knew her capabilities, and he knew the limits of his influence. The gorge seemed alive with history, the stones etched by water and wind over decades, each one a reminder that the land had its own timeline and rules. The Apache woman paused to examine the rock surfaces, identifying subtle mineral veins and moss growth patterns, and the mountain men realized that survival depended not just on awareness of movement but on awareness of context, the story the land could tell if one paused long enough to listen. Midday brought them to a ridge where sunlight bathed the slopes below, revealing a patchwork of forest and meadow. The Apache woman crouched briefly, observing a set of fresh animal tracks crossing the open ground. She marked their direction with a small stick in her journal, noting the spacing and depth, which indicated size and weight. The mountain man watched silently, learning that the lessons he had imparted, careful observation, patience, and attentiveness, had been absorbed and amplified. She moved forward again, adjusting her path to avoid disturbing the tracks unnecessarily, showing respect for both the animals and the environment. Every decision reflected a balance between action and restraint, a nuanced understanding of survival that went far beyond basic necessity. They paused later near a grove of birch trees, the bark pale against the shadowed forest, and she examined the surrounding flora with meticulous attention. The mountain men noted how she distinguished edible plants from those that were poisonous, and even more importantly, how she assessed which were abundant enough to gather sustainably without depleting the natural balance. It struck him that her survival skills had evolved into stewardship, caring for the land while navigating it, a lesson that even he had only begun to understand fully. She prepared a small bundle of herbs and roots, documenting everything in her journal, the record serving both as a guide and a testament to her growing autonomy. As the day wore on, clouds gathered, hinting at rain, and they adjusted their pace and path accordingly. The Apache woman interpreted subtle shifts in wind and humidity, deciding to take shelter beneath a natural overhang rather than push forward. The mountain man admired her foresight. Experience had taught him to respect her judgment, and he followed without hesitation. As the first drops fell, the forest seemed to embrace them with a gentle rhythm, the sound of rain on leaves and stones forming a quiet symphony that reinforced the lesson of patience and observation. They waited for the storm to pass, sharing silence and trust, each aware of the other's presence without needing words. When the rain ceased, they continued along a ridge that overlooked a wide valley, where the river meandered like a silver ribbon beneath the late afternoon sun. The Apache woman paused to scan the area for landmarks and potential hazards, teaching the mountain men once again that perception and anticipation were as vital as physical skill. They descended carefully, maintaining balance and conserving energy, and crossed small streams using stones and fallen logs with the confidence of two people who had come to know the forest intimately. By evening, they found a sheltered glade, perfect for setting up camp, with ample wood and a nearby source of fresh water. As night fell, the fire flickered between them, casting shadows that danced among the trees. The Apache woman catalogued their observations, and the mountain man joined, noting what he had learned from her keen perception. They shared a quiet meal, the air around them filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. Stars emerged overhead, and the mountain man felt a deep calm settle over him, a sense of alignment with the land and with the woman who had become both a companion and a teacher. The shock and awe of earlier experiences had transformed into measured respect, confidence, and harmony with the wilderness. In that silence, he recognized the true depth of survival. The next morning, mist clung to the forest floor, softening the outlines of trees and stones, and the mountain man awoke with a sense of quiet anticipation. The Apache woman was already moving, her bare feet brushing the damp earth as she gathered small bundles of firewood and inspected the surrounding plants for signs of change. Each movement she made was precise, efficient, yet graceful, a reflection of both her strength and the careful attention she had cultivated over weeks in the wilderness. The mountain man followed, noting how she paused frequently, listening to the subtle sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a hawk, the faint scurrying of a small animal. Every pause was purposeful, a rehearsal of awareness that had become instinctive for her and instructive for him. They continued along a winding trail that led to a series of rocky outcroppings, the terrain uneven and challenging. The Apache woman moved with unwavering confidence, testing each footfall, feeling the texture of rock and soil beneath her hands when necessary. The mountain man mirrored her movements, not out of necessity but as a way of integrating her lessons into his own practice. The forest felt alive around them, not merely as a backdrop for survival but as an active participant in their journey. Each sound, each shift of light, each subtle change in scent or wind was noted and considered, shaping their choices as they moved deeper into the wilderness. By midday, they arrived at a small clearing where sunlight poured in, illuminating a carpet of wildflowers and moss. The Apache woman knelt to inspect a patch of herbs, recognizing those that were edible and medicinal, and carefully noted their locations in her journal. The mountain man observed, impressed not just by her knowledge, but by the methodical way she integrated it into practical survival strategy. He understood that mastery of the land was not simply about skill, but about observation, patience, and the willingness to respect its rules. She shared her findings, pointing out the subtle differences between plants, teaching him to see beyond the obvious. As they moved onward, clouds gathered overhead, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. The Apache woman adjusted their route, taking a path that offered shelter from potential rain while maintaining access to fresh water and safe footing. The mountain men followed, appreciating the foresight and decisiveness in her choices. The first drops of rain fell as they reached a natural rock overhang, and they paused to allow the storm to pass. The sound of water tapping leaves and stone created a rhythm that both calmed and sharpened their senses. In this quiet interlude, the mountain men reflected on how much he had learned from her, how observation, patience, and respect could transform a daunting environment into a space of understanding and security. After the rain, the forest seemed refreshed, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and pine. They descended into a valley where a small stream trickled over smooth stones, clear and cool. The Apache woman tested the depth before stepping in, balancing with subtle shifts of weight and confirming secure footing before moving forward. The mountain man crossed alongside her, conscious of how much her confidence and careful attention had reshaped his own approach to movement in the wilderness. Each step reinforced the importance of trust, awareness, and the ability to integrate observation into action. As evening approached, they reached a glade suitable for camping, with a gentle slope, access to fresh water, and an abundance of firewood. The Apache woman arranged the camp, preparing the fire and gathering materials for a simple meal. The mountain men assisted where needed but allowed her independence to guide the process, recognizing that their partnership had evolved into mutual respect rather than hierarchy. The forest seemed to acknowledge this balance, the wind whispering gently through branches, birds settling into their nightly rhythms, and the stream flowing quietly nearby. Night fell, and stars began to pierce the dark canopy. They sat by the fire, reflecting silently on the day's lessons. The Apache woman shared insights about environmental cues, animal behavior, and water sources, integrating them into her growing understanding of long-term survival. The mountain man listened and recorded his own observations, recognizing that he had moved from teacher to learner, absorbing wisdom that came not from books or experience alone, but from careful attention and respect for the rhythms of the land. The shock and awe that had once defined encounters with the unknown had transformed into measured understanding and quiet confidence. In this shared silence, both felt the profound depth of survival, a combination of skill, mindfulness, and the courage to respect boundaries, whether in nature or in themselves. Morning arrived with a muted glow, mist curling along the ridges and filtering through the tall pines, and the mountain man rose with a practiced calm. He moved silently, gathering firewood and checking the traps he had set the previous evening, his actions precise yet unhurried. The Apache woman was already awake, kneeling near the stream to fill a small container with fresh water, her movements deliberate and measured. She paused occasionally to touch the surface, sensing subtle currents in the temperature, demonstrating an awareness that went far beyond necessity. The mountain man watched her, noting how she had transformed her survival into a ritual of observation and respect, and realized that her quiet mastery of the wilderness had reshaped his own approach to moving through the land. They set out along a narrow path that wound through a dense thicket of underbrush, where roots and fallen branches created natural obstacles. The Apache woman moved ahead with confidence, testing each step, shifting her weight in anticipation of uneven ground, and occasionally placing a hand on a tree for balance. He followed, mirroring her attentiveness, aware that her example had taught him to integrate caution with efficiency. Every movement was deliberate, every pause offered information. The forest felt alive in a way it hadn't before, each rustle, bird call, and gust of wind carrying meaning. They had become fluent in its subtle language, learning to interpret not only what was seen but what was implied. By midday, they reached a sunlit clearing dotted with wildflowers, where a shallow pool reflected the sky above. The Apache woman knelt at its edge, observing small fish darting beneath the surface, and checked the surrounding soil for signs of animal activity. She noted the clarity of the water, the quality of the soil, and the presence of edible plants nearby, recording everything in her journal. The mountain man observed quietly, recognizing that her survival skills had evolved into an intuitive understanding of ecological balance, an integration of observation, foresight, and respect. He marveled at her ability to make precise judgments in real time, transforming raw knowledge into practical strategy. The afternoon brought clouds that hinted at rain, and the Apache woman adjusted their path, guiding them to a natural rock overhang that offered shelter. As the first drops fell, she listened to the rhythm of water hitting leaves and stones, interpreting patterns that revealed subtle shifts in wind and humidity. The mountain men mirrored her attentiveness, realizing that survival was no longer solely about physical skill, it was about anticipation, mindfulness, and the ability to act with foresight. The forest seemed to respond to their presence, settling into a harmonious rhythm that reinforced both calm and focus. After the rain, they continued along a ridge overlooking a broad valley, where the river wound like a silver thread below. The Apache woman pointed out landmarks, tracking potential hazards and water sources, and the mountain men absorbed her observations, learning to read the terrain with the same fluid intuition. They moved carefully down the slope, crossing small streams with practiced balance, each step a demonstration of coordination and awareness. Her confidence had become their shared rhythm, a measured tempo that emphasized caution, respect, and deliberate action. As evening approached, they found a sheltered glade for camp, with abundant firewood and a nearby spring. The Apache woman arranged the area, preparing the fire and organizing provisions with care, while the mountain men assisted where necessary, respecting her leadership. The forest seemed to acknowledge the harmony, the gentle rustle of leaves and the soft flow of water creating a peaceful backdrop. They shared a simple meal, sitting in quiet reflection, their thoughts aligned with the rhythms of nature around them. Nightfall brought a sky brimming with stars, and they sat near the fire, reviewing the day's experiences. The Apache woman shared insights into animal movement, weather cues, and navigation techniques, reinforcing lessons learned through practice rather than instruction. The mountain men listened intently, recording observations and reflecting on the evolution of their partnership. What had begun as solitary survival and cautious mentorship had transformed into mutual respect, deep trust, and a shared understanding of the forest's intricate patterns. Shock and awe had given way to clarity and confidence, and the lessons of the ravine had long since settled into a steady foundation of awareness and deliberate action. In that silence, they recognized the profound truth of survival. Mastery was not in domination, but in listening, observing, and moving with intention, guided by respect for both the land and each other.